October 21st, 1856, Natchez District, Mississippi. First dark came on like a slow-lidded eye, and the carriage yard breathed back the day's heat from red clay that kept secrets the way a ledger keeps sums. Lanterns flickered along the big house portico, their halos wavering against white columns, while, down by the river, a church bell laid iron into the air with each measured stroke. Before we step further into this night's accounting, tell from which place you are watching, and at what hour this story has reached you, so we may learn how far its echoes have traveled. Josiah Greene stood in the yard's margin where hoofprints had dried to cups, his name carried only in breath, his palm resting on a brass tinderbox, warm as if it remembered a hand that wasn't his. The box felt smaller than a snuff tin and heavier than any statute. Its hinge clicked soft when tested, a door's cousin in miniature, as if even a trinket carried the grammar of passage. Smoke from the kitchen chimney leaned sideways in a weak wind that tasted of ash and molasses, and the house's windows took the last light and held it like private property. He listened to the bell, one then another, and counted not piety, but intervals, each toll and index finger drawn across the night to mark a place where breath might turn. Names rose behind his ribs as a murmur, not yet spoken aloud. They had taught him the cadence of memory, the way old hands teach a boy to curry a restless mare, slow and sure until the heat of the animal passes under the brush. A servant crossed the yard, bearing a folded white cloth over an arm. It glowed briefly in the orange wash of a lantern, bone-bright and mute. It looked like a proclamation and a flag and a shroud all at once, but tonight the cloth would be asked to mean something else, something no host intended. The tinderbox carried more than spark. It was a kind of ear, a listening object that accepted the story of a thumbprint, the oil of a palm, the press of a vow. Its hinge had a personality, a shy click, a swallowed sigh, that made him think of larger doors he had learned to read. Which lock begged grease, which latch lifted with a fingernail and patience, which hinge croaked like a sick throat at night, and thus could not be trusted for quiet. The yard smelled of manure and leather oil, a resin note from the tool room ghosting on the breeze, and the sound of a far-off fiddle trickled from the dining room, where polished forks would soon flash like minor constellations. Josiah tipped the box, felt the tidy weight of flint and steel, and a pinch of char tucked inside. He did not strike it. He tested readiness the way a man touches the hem of a coat before walking into weather. The bell's next stroke moved through his sternum as a slow hammer. Fields lay black and waiting beyond the yard, each furrow a line in a book someone else wrote, each row a sentence he had memorized with his body. Inside the house, a door shut with a posture of finality. The plank caught, the latch fell, the hinge confessed the habit of a house that assumed nothing would resist it. He thought of rooms by their aromas and their tempers, the library of ink and turpentine where numbers tried to cage breath, the corridor that funneled footsteps past the pantry, the stair that lifted men on the backs of other men's hours, the parlor where white cloth reigned with the confidence of snow. He drew the tinderbox closer, a companion more truthful than any oath spoken across polished wood. The brass took his warmth and gave a resolve back. If a box could be a thesis, this one was. Small, bright, exacting. Night thickened. The first stars arrived like quiet witnesses above the black of cane and cotton. Somewhere a hinge gave a tired cry and went still. He could taste iron in the air, the bell's tone leaving its afterflavor on his tongue. He allowed one name to step from silence into thought. Only one, and let it settle like a coin under his tongue, a liturgy begun but not recited. He folded the tinderbox into his pocket, felt its square promise against his thigh, and took one step toward the shadowed edge of the yard, where packed earth shifted to the house's wash of lamplight. Before the tale travels on, Tell from what place you keep watch, and at what hour this telling has touched your door, that we may reckon how far the bell's breath has carried. Night came on with a dry chill that threaded the bluff roads above Natchez, where tavern lanterns swayed and auction flags cracked like small whips in the breeze. In town, fiddles leapt and stamped, bow hair rasping bright, and cider foamed into tin with a cheerful hiss, while boots rang the cobbles like coins spilling from a careless purse. Far from that noise, the big house threw a rectangle of light across its dining room, a white cloth stretched so smooth it seemed to deny the very notion of stain, porcelain waiting in regimented ranks, the faint perfume of beeswax rising from polished wood. Down the slope, the slave quarters hunched low against wind that slipped under sill and through chinks, bringing the damp along with it as if the river itself had learned to walk. Doors swelled and grudged their duty. Hinges rasped like tired lungs, catching at the breath before letting it go. Ash-sour smoke pooled beneath rafters, clinging to hair and garments, and thin bowls of corn mush steamed with a humility that mocked the parlor's plenty. A baby coughed, then slept. A woman's palm warmed a child's back with the rhythm of a bell no tower owned. From the house came laughter sharp as glass, a toast rising and falling with practiced grace. Forks chimed delicately, small bells of appetite, and the white cloth caught candlelight, reflecting it upward like a polished conscience. In that glow, contracts lay folded in a sideboard drawer, ledgers asleep, yet not resting, ready to wake at dawn and count what could not be counted without wounding. The air tasted of cinnamon and roasted fat, sweetness layered upon power like a second skin. Between these climates Josiah moved, carrying the knowledge in his body the way a man carries weather in his bones. The kitchen passage exhaled heat against his face, then the back step delivered him to air that bit like nettles. His hands learned the temperature of both worlds, and his breath adjusted, obedient to neither. In the corridor, a door latch lifted with that soft, particular click he had memorized, a syllable in the house's language. On the yard path frost took a shallow hold, whitening the wagon ruts as if they were lines in a book turned pale with overreading. He listened for bells and heard different sermons. From town, a jubilant peal that blessed commerce and story. From the river bluff, a slower tongue that measured hours with iron mercy. The quarters received both as distant orders. The parlor received them as accompaniment. Names flickered in Josiah's chest, but remained unspoken, waiting for the proper room to hear them. The tinderbox in his pocket kept its square counsel, warm against the cloth, its hinge a private promise of opening where opening had long been denied. Above the fields the sky showed a seam of stars, thin as stitches in a mended sleeve. The house inhaled and exhaled through doors that believed themselves eternal. The cabins tucked their light under tin to keep the dark from stealing it. Between sanctioned glow and patient gloom, a road stretched, packed earth, dew-slicked, edged with broom sedge, that knew every footfall and kept none. Josiah paused at the threshold of the service hall, feeling the draft decide which way to travel, and let the moment teach him again how 2 winters can live inside 1 night without ever touching. Late afternoon light once fell through the washroom's high, clouded pane in a pale sheet, and the scent of lye rode the steam like a stern hymn. There, with water cooling in the wooden tub and a white cloth wrung thin between her hands, Liza leaned close to Josiah and made a promise no ink recorded. "Endure," she said, voice a hush that tried to be a shelter, "and they will not set our boy upon a block." The cloth twisted to a rope of wet linen in her grip, and he took it gently from her, as if by uncoiling it he might unbind the world. Outside, a bell murmured the hour with modest metal, less decree than heartbeat, and in that modestness they trusted. The overseer stood later at the corridor mouth, leaning on a jamb as though he were the house's hinge, and nodded with the casual gravity of one too accustomed to being believed. No paper changed hands, no seal pressed wax, only a glance that pretended to be covenant. The corners of his mouth weighed nothing. The weight fell elsewhere. Josiah left the washroom with the taste of soap in the back of his throat, and the sense that he had been given a contract written on fog. Spring arrived lean as a stray dog, and Debt walked behind it, with a ledger under its arm. News traveled like cold through chimneys. The boy, their boy, was to stand at the courthouse steps by the river road. Josiah was ordered to the stable. Duty is the mask worn by theft. He did not see the sail, but men see without eyes when the heart refuses blindness. A hand who had gone to town described it small and plain, the child upon a plank, a strip of white cloth knotted at the sleeve, fluttering in the river wind like the smallest weather. The cloth was the same color as table dressings in the parlor. Here it meant a price. A bell rang up the bluff to mark the next hour, and made no distinction between mercy and its absence. Weeks turned like the slow pages of a damp book. The name of Cane Country rode back on a steamboatman's breath, and with it the word flux, as if a river had learned to run inside a body and drown it from within. No grave was pointed to, no stone engraved. Liza's hands went still for a day, and then resumed their work as if work itself were the last law left. Josiah found himself in the smokehouse corridor that evening, where salt bit the air and old soot kept counsel along the brick. The door to the yard had been ill kept. One of its pins had fallen, and a bright hinge nail lay in ash like a stubborn star. He knelt and picked the small iron from the black grit, turning it in his fingers until it stung. A nail that once gave a door its movement now sat among cinders, proof that even engines of order come apart. In that piece of metal he read what the overseer's nod had refused to confess, that promises made without witness have the lifespan of sparks. He closed his hand around the nail and felt its heat pass to him, or his to it. The exchange made a quiet oath, real. A bell far off counted another hour, and the sound felt less like time, and more like a hammer measuring the length of his patience. He spoke no vow aloud. He set the hinge nail on the window ledge, where a sliver of light took it, and made it briefly ceremonial. Names gathered behind his teeth like a choir not yet called forward. The tinderbox in his pocket seemed to gain weight, not as a weapon gains it, but as an instrument does when a player knows the song. Doors would learn a new grammar, cloth would find a different meaning, ledgers would be shown their arithmetic could be changed to ash. The world that had converted a child to an entry would be asked to reckon with what follows a line drawn too far. When he left the corridor, the nail remained where he had placed it, a small ordinance against forgetting. The house breathed around him, doors exhaling with the practiced entitlement of timber long in charge, hinges muttering their coppery vowels. He moved along the pantry passage and out to the yard, where dew had already begun to gather in the wagon ruts, each shallow bowl brightening toward nightfall. He felt the bell's next note in his sternum before he heard it with his ear. It steadied him like a hand at the back. He didn't rehearse grief. He set it down inside himself with care, as one sets a bowl upon a shelf reserved for one purpose. In the washroom days before, Liza had twisted a white cloth in worry. Now he imagined the same cloth lifted to a line, washed of the meaning others gave it, allowed to learn the wind. Such imaginings were not rescue, but they were breath. He touched the brass hinge of the service door as he passed, and found it wanted oil, a need he would answer soon. The language of doors would become legible. He took the yard's edge to the tool room, where resin and leather shared the air, carrying with him a covenant that had shed the weaknesses of speech. When the bell tolled again, the sound found him working his jaw as if chewing a word he would not spit out. The promise had broken. What persisted, sharpened by that shattering, was the answer he would carry forward in silence. Night drew its breath along the carriage bay, and the tool room answered with the close smell of resin, old leather, and damp wood. A barn lantern swung from a hook, throwing a cuff of light that ribbed the walls in shadow bars. Dust rose and settled like patient ash. Josiah stepped inside and let the door fall near shut until its latch kissed the keep with a modest click, the kind a house ignores. The room held what men trusted, handles smoothed by years, steel kept honed by habit, coils of rope that remembered every knot, and at the center of these reliances leaned the old axe, quiet as a deacon at the back of a meeting. He did not lift it to weigh its strike. He set thumb to iron and cheek to the haft, seeking what the fibers might tell. The hickory held a faint tremor, as though the sapwood had kept a heartbeat in its sleep. The handle's varnish gave off a whisper of turpentine that pricked his eyes. He tuned himself to those small declarations the way a man listens for weather in the hinge of a gate. What he asked of the axe was not edge, but memory, whether it could keep counsel and carry weight, whether wood and iron might serve as ear when no human witness stood near enough to hear. He turned the blade sideways and settled it, edge down, into a shallow chink between floorboards, pressing until the haft wedged firm. No swing now, only stillness turned to purpose. The axe would be a stone where a door wished to move, a quiet body leaned against a will too used to its own way. He rocked the haft once, felt the timber accept the task, and left it there, as one leaves a trusted elder on a threshold. On the bench lay his brass tinderbox, the stubborn hinge newly rubbed with lard, so it would open like a courtesy, and not a cough. Beside it he placed a modest shrine of means, a twist of lamp wick cut narrow as a shoelace and rubbed with tallow until it shone dull. A scrap torn from a dead ledger, almost translucent at the edges where many fingers had turned it. A pinch of soot rubbed between forefinger and thumb until the grain felt like the fine sand at the river bend. He slid the wick into a seam beneath a loose floorboard where air breathed slow and steady, not enough to shout flame into a rush, but enough to teach it patience. The ledger scrap he folded once more and laid atop the tinderbox like a lid turned to paper. Too slight to stop a spark, just enough to school it. He would use paper to teach fire a different alphabet. Let it speak in S, in C, in slow, in curl. He tested the wick's thirst with a single breath. It lifted barely, as if nodding assent. In the harness room beyond, leather creaked as a strap relaxed, and the sound came off the walls like a prayer that had grown content with being unheard by men. Bells drifted thin from the riverside, less proclamation than metronome. He counted the spacing and felt the beat stack itself inside his ribs, a shelf where he could set the night steps without dropping any. The axe did not gleam. It absorbed the lantern and gave back calm. He ran a knuckle along the haft again, and the wood answered with a quiet thrum, neither threat nor comfort, only agreement. On a high peg hung a coil of cotton cord, long retired from respectable duty, frayed where it had once borne weight. He drew 3 arm lengths and wound it around the tinderbox, then tucked the tied bundle into a canvas sack marked with a faded contract stamp. The stamp's letters had bled into one another with time. What once spelled ownership now showed only the blur of claim. He smiled without showing teeth and pushed the sack beneath the bench where cool air pooled, the kind of place a breath might be kept safe. He checked the door again, eased it almost closed, then placed his palm flat across the panel to feel the house through the wood. Somewhere to his left, a hinge sighed, one he would oil at first chance. Farther off, a latch clicked like a cricket. He mapped those voices in his head and let the axe's silence complete the choir. He took up the tinderbox once more, felt the square surety of it in his hand, and slipped it into his pocket where his list of names had warmed the cloth. Lantern light drew a thin gold seam along the haft's length, and for a moment it resembled a plumb line dropped from some steady heaven. He left it standing, a steady shoulder against a door he had not yet asked to keep. As he stepped out, the latch gave that modest kiss again. Bells breathed another interval into the yard. Behind him, wood and iron waited without impatience, having listened long and promising to keep listening until the hour called them to answer. The library kept autumn inside it, the resin of polished mahogany, a breath of ink, the faint sting of turpentine clinging to the paneled walls. Candles divided the air into neat territories of light, and upon the great desk lay ledgers whose spines wore the fatigue of years, like old soldiers. Josiah paused at the threshold, unseen, listening to paper move as if it possessed lungs. Columns marched in narrow streets of ink, adding and subtracting until lives became a sum obedient to a hand. Here, power trained itself to look respectable. He noted where wax dripped and hardened like small decrees. He measured the distance from hearth to desk to door, and marked in his mind the draft that nudged a corner of parchment whenever the latch breathed open. Numbers ruled this room the way bells rule a town, by rhythm, repetition, and the promise that deviation will be corrected. He took the corridor beyond, where the house's spine turned toward the pantry stairs. Above, in a narrow sleeping loft that borrowed heat from others' labor, the overseer kept his dominion on a nail, a ring of keys that clacked dull when he shifted in his cot. The chamber smelled of salt pork, boot grease, and the sour of ale dried into wood. Locks below, storeroom, garden gate, harness press. Each imagined itself a mouth that could swallow passage and keep it. Josiah stood beneath the nail and let the sound of the keys speak their conceit. He counted their language by weight and shape, the long shank that owned the garden pad, the stubby tooth that bullied the store. Hinges in this hallway had learned to announce themselves like town criers. He placed 2 fingers against one leaf and felt the tremor that meant it could be taught to whisper. Here, authority was not a man's size, but metal's habit. The parlor wore a social perfume, citrus peel, beeswax, the faint tang of wine breathing out of crystal. And above the mantel, a portrait watched with the indifference of pigment. Ivory tugged a bell from the ceiling to the kitchen, its cord dropping like a pale vein along the wallpaper. 1 pull to summon, 2 to admonish, 3 to display. The auctioneer, when present, treated that cord as scripture, speaking to it with rings and smiles as if it were a tame spirit. The white cloth dressed the sideboard and small pedestal tables like winter made polite, and the sound of conversation made a shallow music that mistook itself for fate. Josiah felt how air moved through this room, slow, circular, forever coaxed toward comfort, and stored the pattern as a map for what comfort denies. The bell here did not call souls, it called service, and he learned its tone as one learns a warning in a field wind. At last he stood in the dining room where the table ran like a road of dark wood from window to hearth. Silver ranked itself with the discipline of drills, and at the head the matriarch's chair wore height like a crown. The cloth seemed a page waiting for the hand that presumed to write across it, and candle flame found forgiven faces in every curve of spoon. At a murmur, the household would arrange itself into listening. At a nod, it would consume. He tracked the vents in the floor that carried warmth into the room, and the hairline crack in the service door that let a thread of air creep through. The kind of breath that feeds flame without announcing it. He bent, as if to polish a rail, and glimpsed the underside of the board, rawer, hungrier wood looking back, where oil might cling and remember. These were the 4 lessons, each taught by a room that believed itself eternal. In the library, accounting wore a gentleman's coat. In the loft, keys jingled a private law. In the parlor, the bell translated appetite into command. At the table, height rehearsed verdicts with silver for witnesses. He did not argue with any of it. He learned instead. He pocketed their tempos, the dry tick of a quill, the lazy roll of a key, the soft thrum of a cord plucked by a finger, the small exhale a chair gives when authority sits. Bells outside told a patient distance, one and then another, laying a seam across his thoughts. He walked back through the corridor with the surety of a man who has read a book others think he cannot read. On his way past the pantry, he paused to test a hinge with a drop of grease coaxed from his thumb. It sighed and accepted instruction. He touched the parlor's bell cord once, tracing its twist, then let it fall without a sound. In the library he noted a brass stopper at the door, how it might be taught to keep the room almost closed, neither shut nor open, a mouth that feeds slowly. At the dining room threshold he let his breath find the draft's line, feeling how it slid beneath the cloth to the place where wood remembered sap. He kept his eyes lowered, his hands ordinary, his steps without announcement. But within, the lessons arranged themselves as a quiet grammar: ledger, key, bell, cloth. Each word would alter meaning when the hour required, the way a bell changes from call to verdict when the night deepens and refuses to give it back. The evening cooled to a thin edge as Josiah stepped from yard to scullery passage, the air changing from damp leaf to stove heat in the space of a single breath. Lamp flame wobbled within its glass and drew a narrow, honey-colored lane along the flagstones. He set his palm to the back door latch, flat iron worn to a satin by years, and lifted it until the tongue cleared the keeper with that soft, reluctant rise he had already measured. The door gave, no rattle, only a hush of wood on wood, and a draught nosed past his cheek like a cautious animal learning a hand. He moved through the kitchen hall, counting without numbers, letting distances reside in muscle. 3 strides to the hearth's black mouth, 5 to the long table scarred by knife and pot, 7 more to the hinge that once shouted, and now, after his touch earlier, sighed like a tired singer finding the right key. He paused at the pantry hinge leaf and pressed his thumb to its joint. The metal held a damp sheen of grease that promised obedience. Farther on, the stair took his weight 1 tread at a time, and the old board beneath his right foot answered with a petulant creak. He could play around later like a skip note in a song. At the cellar mouth, he knelt to the loose brick he had tested already. It lifted with a gritty release as if exhaling a secret. Behind it, the clay pot waited, pine knots nested in their own resin fumes. He eased the pot deeper into its pocket, then set the brick back with the gentleness one gives to a sleeping child's blanket. In his pocket, folded rag hid the coil of lamp wick, and he slid 1 corner free to check its temper. Tallow slick, pliant, quiet as a held breath. The tinderbox, square and sure, warmed his thigh through the cloth, a small pulse against the larger drum of the house. He crossed the dining room on the shadowed side where the white cloth's reflected glow did not expose him, and kneeled where floor met wainscot. Chalk, rubbed from a bit of limestone, left a pale, private mark beneath the table skirt, no bigger than a thumbnail, to remind his hand where the crawl-space mouth began. He brushed the mark with his knuckle and felt the faint grit lift. Even the wall seemed to remember it. From the service door's hairline crack, a thin thread of air licked his wrist, steady, not strong, exactly the breath he'd counted on to nurse a coal without feeding a shout. Back through the corridor, he stopped at the kitchen's mantel clock. Its tick was thinner than the river bell's iron, a reed pipe against a cathedral bell, yet it held faith with the seconds, stitching them into a firm seam. Downriver, the ferry bell threw a broader sound across the night. The 2 voices, one small and near, one big and far, ran together in his ear until they braided into a single chord, tugging time toward the narrow passage of midnight. He filed their harmony inside him, a metronome no hand could still. He drew from his pocket the torn list of names and did not unfold it. The paper knew its shapes, and his fingertips read the creases the way a blind man reads raised letters. He put it back as if returning a precious instrument to its case. A door somewhere above kissed its jamb, gentle as agreement. He tested the back latch once more, eased it into place, and let the hinge offer its new, compliant whisper. The house had learned his language for the night. He stood in the scullery's dim and breathed in coal, soap, and a faint, clean edge of resin from the tool-room, feeling the hours draw tight as a cinched strap. Then he turned toward the smokehouse path, where the dark was waiting in order, ready for names. The smokehouse held the night like a sealed jar, its salt-sour air cool against Josiah's skin as he eased the door to a near close and let the latch rest without complaint. A thin ribbon of moonlight slid through the vent and silvered the curve of the salt barrel. Everything else belonged to shadow and the steady breath of the house beyond. From the yard came a far thrum, drums or fairy, or both, beating a pulse that did not ask permission. Between those notes the crickets stitched their patient seam, and the faintest iron from the river bell drifted up the bluff like a memory not yet willing to be named. He knelt by the salt barrel where brine had crusted like frost along the rim. The floor was cool through his trousers. The plank pattern pressed a hush into his knees. He brought out the folded scrap without opening it, for he knew the names more by the ridges of paper than by the ink. Liza first, then the boy. Aunt Scylla with her hands that smelled of mint. Old Ben with the limp that matched the pace of a field bell. He placed the paper against his sternum, a reliquary under skin, and the names breathed with his breath, rising and falling as though the chest itself had become a pew. He let their syllables form on his tongue without sound, a liturgy conducted in the sanctuary of blood where no eavesdropper could reach. He drew the tinderbox and set it in his palm as one sets a psalter, not to display, but to steady. Flint touched steel once, a kiss withheld, and he listened to the quiet remain itself, unbroken. A single thread of lampwick lay coiled in his other hand, narrow as a promise, pliant as mercy when it is chosen instead of demanded. He ran the wick along his thumb and felt the tallow's faint tack, a texture that said it would accept ember the way a door accepts a key, reluctant in the first instant, then obedient to the purpose shaped for it. Down the corridor outside the smokehouse, a procession of doors practiced their small weather. One shutter rattled, one hinge answered with a mouse's squeak, one latch settled like a breath at the end of a prayer. He had learned these dialects and could tell them apart now as easily as faces. The house spoke in timber vowels, in coppery consonants. Tonight he required it to speak in whispers alone. He laid the wick against his palm once more and pressed it there, a vow sealed not with heat but with nearness. The bell on the bluff tolled 11 with a dignity that made the dark stand straighter. Each stroke arrived round and whole, then thin to a thread that tugged him forward. He watched the dust drift in the moonslit and thought of ledgers curling when corners meet warm breath. Not yet, he counseled, not yet. The tinderbox hinge moved under his thumb with that shy courtesy he had coaxed from it earlier, and he closed it again, asking the brass to keep its secret a little longer. He breathed the smokehouse, salted meat, old oak, the ghost of last season's hickory, and let those smells layer themselves into his resolve. A name rose he had not expected, one of the men who had once spoken for him when the count in the field came up too quick, and he added it to the quiet roll, for debts and gifts alike ride in the same ledger when the soul is honest. He pressed 2 fingers to the floor where the boards widened and felt the cooler seam where earth waited beneath. Even the ground seemed to hold its breath, as if soil could listen and choose. He slid the folded scrap back into his pocket and touched the wick to his lips, a kiss not of flame, but of promise. The tinderbox went next, its square weight settling against the paper like a hand upon a shoulder. Outside, a gust nosed under the sill and lifted the edge of a hanging cloth to a slow sway. It was not the white of auction today, but a grease-stained kitchen towel left to dry, and even so it learned a gentler vocabulary under the draft, Less command, more consent. He rose without hurry, letting knees unbend with the patience of old wood. As he set his palm to the smokehouse door, he listened once more for the corridor's voices. No shout, no scrape, only that small mouse squeak yielding softer than before. He eased the door open and let the cooler yard air meet his face. 11's echo was fading into a pressure more felt than heard, and with it the world tilted toward the narrow hour. He stepped into the path that ran between scullery and cellar, carrying names like a concealed psalm and Wick like a strand of future time, and the night, already convened, seemed to move aside to let him pass. The library held its own weather, warmth pooled by the grate, draughts threading like thin knives under the door, candle smoke tracing small sermons against paneled walls. The master bent over ledgers as if bending over a cradle, breath fogging the margins when he muttered totals, a quill ticking its dry metronome across the ruled lines. Paper exhaled a scent of damp straw and iron ink. The seal press on the desk crouched like a patient animal, ready to bite wax into obedience. Outside the window, the river's black ribbon wore a shard of moon. Inside, columns and sums marched in formation, certain of their direction. Josiah entered, carrying a coal scuttle and an armful of split pine. His steps measured the room's grammar, 2 from threshold to hearth, 1 to kneel, 3 to the side when the brass fender caught the light. The master did not fully look up. He waved a hand as if parting a curtain and said, "There," and quickly, the way a bell tells noon, by habit, not thought. Josiah's face showed only the patience of service. Inwardly, he watched the air move, saw how it tugged the corner of a ledger leaf whenever the door sighed, felt where warmth gathered in pockets above the grate before climbing the chimney throat. He laid the first pine split in the firebox, heartwood aligned like a rib. A second piece, whittled thinner, he cradled atop it, hollowed to receive a coal without choking it. The lamp wick came next, planted earlier in the shadows of planning, drawn from his pocket as a mere adjustment, a servant's nothing. The strand had been rubbed to a dull sheen with tallow until it looked like a narrow vein of fat, an innocent ribbon. He tucked it under the great lip, where air slid in a quiet stream, not fierce enough to shout, but steady enough to school. The wick did not yet burn. It waited with the patience of a long-held name. From the scuttle he took a coal, red in its core, like an eye that refuses to sleep, cupped it with tongs, and set it into the little hollow of pine he had carved. The ember kissed wood, breathed, dimmed, then deepened again. The thin split exhaled a resin note that stitched itself into the library's bouquet of ink and polish. The master coughed and swiped at his nose with a handkerchief. "Draft," he complained to the numbers, and bent lower, his head haloed by his own labor's breath. Josiah placed the brass doorstop in its accustomed wedge, not to close the room, not to open it, but to keep the door almost a mouth learning to feed slowly. This small geometry taught air to take the wick's lesson, sipping rather than gulping, lulling rather than leaping. He straightened the loose corner of a ledger page with 2 fingers and felt the paper's tooth. At the margin, where the master's quill had once hesitated, the fibers were frayed as if time had been filing them down. He glanced at the totals lined like fence rails, names translated into weight, into bushels, into dollars, each mark a door closing over a life. The wick accepted Ember at last, not with flame but with bloom, a glow that crawled along its thread like a thought becoming speech. Smoke began where the wick's mouth met the ledger's breath, first the quietest gray, then a deeper language. Corners shivered, curled, like leaves touched by a sun too near, then settled into a patient fold. A sweetness went sour in the air, a sugar from paste heated, past its courtesy, and the master frowned without lifting his eyes, as if annoyed at a guest who had used the wrong fork. Josiah replaced the scuttle lid with an economy that spoke of long practice. He did not watch the fire, he watched the arithmetic. The spine of one ledger arched subtly as binding warmed. A ribbon marker shrank upon itself and pointed nowhere. At the hearth, the thinner split darkened, and the coal at its heart pulsed like a bellows, content to breathe without roaring. The doors almost closed kept the room's lungs under discipline. In this way, the planted detail reached its purpose, not as spectacle, but as amendment. A smoldering footnote added to a text that had presumed to be the whole. The master's pen faltered. A blot opened like an eclipse over a tidy sum. He dabbed with sand, annoyed, then coughed again, the sound tearing fabric in the quiet. "Stoke it or douse it," he said, eyes on the page that no longer held still. Josiah adjusted nothing. He merely set a second pine sliver in a posture of seeming care, which sheltered the ember's path and turned smoke toward the ledger's underbreath. The paper grew more articulate as it warmed, curling inward in the slow dignity of parchment, reconsidering oath. Names lifted from the page not as letters, but as a scent rising, a ghostly choir the nose could hear. He stepped back to the threshold and let his hand rest on the door, feeling the narrow passage of air tug between his fingers. The wick's light was a whisper behind the grate. The ledger's corners spoke in consonants. Of ash? The master blinked and leaned closer to his own authority, squinting at arithmetic now veiled. In the window's ghost, he looked like a man reading his own obituary and refusing to admit the name was his. The seal press shone dull, its mouth closed against wax that would not arrive. Beyond the glass, the bluff bell tolled 11:30 with iron patience, its tone threading under the door and through Josiah's bones. He let the sound measure his departure. A candle guttered and regained itself. The smoke fingered the portrait frames and returned to the business at the desk. He lifted the doorstop with quiet thumb and let the door keep its near-shut posture, a sentinel instructed to breathe just enough. The master's cough became a sentence without grammar. Sums blurred to weather. Contracts forgot their spine. Josiah turned into the corridor where the house's smaller vowels awaited him. Hinges, latches, soft tongues of draught. He did not look back. Behind him, the sanctum of numbers learned a new arithmetic. Ember, wick, paper, air. The room would not blaze. It would think itself into ash. The bell's fading hum walked beside him like a steady companion as he went to meet the next altar, the wick's ghost and the ledger's breath still speaking along the back of his tongue. The pantry corridor held a narrow cold, a draught that nosed along the baseboards and kept company with the smell of flour and lard. A lantern threw its small circle, making the walls seem closer than they were, and the stair above muttered under weight that did not move gently. The overseer blocked the passage with his hips and shoulders, a keyring bright at his belt, the metal teeth chiming a petty anthem each time he shifted. Before him, a housemaid clutched her basket tight to her middle. Her sleeve had torn, and the pale fabric showed like a wound that refused to bleed. Josiah came from the shadowed turn where the scullery air cooled the skin after the kitchen's heat. He counted the breaths of the corridor the way he counted fields at dawn. 1, 2, steady, and felt the draught test his knuckles. The axe he had stationed for listening now served as a stone. He drew it with a practiced lift and set the iron head down at the back kitchen door's heel, turned sideways so the haft leaned into the jamb. No swing, no threat, only weight becoming grammar. The door pressed against it and learned it would not close. A hinge he had schooled earlier with bacon grease settled into its new duty, and offered only a low consent in place of its former complaint. "Back to the pantry," the overseer said without looking at her, his chin aimed at the girl as if it were a pointer. He rolled the keys once, enjoying their clatter. "This way is not yours." Josiah said nothing. He reached for the latch with 2 fingers, lifted it the small distance that freed the tongue from its keeper, the very lift he had memorized with the patience of a locksmith, and pushed. The door obeyed him without voice, swinging inward as if hearing prayer. Draught strode through the corridor at once, and the lantern flame inclined, bowing to the new order. The girl startled at the invitation space gave her. That torn white sleeve lifted like a sudden wing. Josiah tilted his shoulder the barest degree, making a human breakwater between her and the ring of keys, and with that the path was a road. She slipped along the wall, soft as breath, leaving a mouth in sleep, and was past the overseer before his hand decided to act. "Hoy!" he barked, reaching wide to catch a departing hem, but his palm met the draught and the edge of a basket only. The keys clanged when he lunged. His boot skidded on a patch of grease-hazed stone where many dinners had been born, and few dignities had survived. He went down to a knee in a graceless worship before the door that had refused his blessing, and the stair above gave a sympathetic groan, as if to mark the fall in its ledger of sounds. The ring bounced and rolled. Josiah let it travel and watched where it settled. A tone-dead circle against the threshold. Their brag quieted. He pressed a scrap of thin paper, harvested from a dead contract, between thumb and latch and eased the plate's edge so that metal would not chatter when he drew the bolt the rest of the way. Paper taught iron to keep its tongue. The latch slid home with the politeness of good schooling. Behind him the axe held steady. Its haft looked like a sober back, shouldering more than its share for the sake of a household's better manners. The overseer's mouth found fury, but his breath had not yet learned how to wear it. He pushed himself up with both hands and discovered that dignity is heavier than any man expects when the floor refuses to lift it. His eyes cut to Josiah, looking for a name to call, and finding none. A servant without a voice is harder to charge than a man who argues. He snatched at the keys, fingers fumbling, and found that the ring had lodged against the plank with a mean little certainty, as if wood had opinions at last. From the bluff the bell spoke the quarter before midnight in a tone that did not care for corridors or quarrels. The sound traveled down the stairwell like a careful river, touching each tread, blessing none. Josiah's silence made a clean room for that iron to dwell in. He set the axe a hair deeper, felt the wood accept his meaning, and turned his palm outward to the still open way. The girl, already gone to her chores or her bed or her own quiet salvation, would carry the story in her bones, not as spectacle, but as adjustment. The door had changed its allegiance, the hinge had learned a gentler tongue, and the key had clattered without law. The overseer found his feet and his glare, and very little else. "You?" he said, but the corridor took the word and thinned it, and the lantern trimmed it shorter. Josiah stepped aside from the draught, letting air declare victory, the way water does over stone, with persistence, not applause. He neither bowed nor stared. He let the house read him as it wished. The paper scrap tucked itself back into his palm as if it were skin. The latch, pleased with its lesson, kept quiet. He turned toward the scullery passage that led to the next turning of the night, the bell's distant iron measuring his stride. Behind him the keys stilled. The garment's pale edge was no longer a claim, but a memory of motion, and the door, propped by an axe that had given up cutting to learn holding, stood ajar in a new language. The corridor, briefly a road, grew narrow again, and Josiah walked into the room where the house kept its stairs and its old sermons. The great stair lifted from the foyer like a river of wood, its banister polished to a ripened shine by generations of hands. On the landing, the tall clock kept its private weather, the faint tick like a nail tapping on glass, behind a pane that held a pale reflection of anyone who dared meet it. The auctioneer climbed with the careful carelessness of a man who believes the house loves him. A glass of fortified wine upheld like a chalice, his mouth already shaping a verse about order, profit, and the world arranged in tidy measures. Josiah stood 2 turns below, the stair's shadow covering him to the belt, his sleeve brushed with an ash no eye would name unless it already knew the language of coals. He let his palm hover near the rail and felt the house breathe up and down the well, warm air climbing from the dining room, cooler tendrils falling from unlit rooms above. The clock's heartbeat stitched seconds into certainty. Between those stitches he heard the quieter syllables of the night, the hush of doors resting, the sleepy murmur of a hinge that had learned courtesy, the distant even iron of the bluff bell waiting for its next word. "Consider the lilies," the auctioneer declaimed, his voice rounding the stairwell like poured syrup. "And consider the books. We steward both." He loved the sound more than the sense. It showed in the way he shaped the vowels and neglected the verbs. He placed his foot where height begins to believe itself proof, heel reaching for the curve that turned the eye into the next theology of ascent. Josiah let his gaze rest on the tread whose lip bore a shaving's worth of absence, the shallow notch he had chalked in his mind when he mapped the house by touch and temper. It was not a trap, not a snare, only a difference so modest it might teach a man to notice where he puts his weight. He did not speak. He did not shift. He let gravity write its usual sentence and invited it to add a single comma. The glass clinked lightly against the rail as the auctioneer lifted it for emphasis. His heel found the notch, and sermon met carpentry. A wobble moved through his posture like a truth uninvited. His knee bent, his free hand shot for the banister, his verse fractured into consonants. Wine slopped and drew a aumône, dark whirled upon the polished rise, then ran in a modest line toward the lower step where wood drank what pride had spilled. Josiah stepped, not to assist and not to abandon, but to stand where harm would not find the innocent. He put his shoulder toward the void and his quiet into the space where panic likes to live. The clock ticked on, immaculate in its small justice. Above, a door took a breath and held it. Below, the foyer's air accepted the brief disturbance and then laid it down. "Steady there," the auctioneer puffed, voice edged with a laughter that wanted to exist and did not find the oxygen. Scripture drained from his mouth and left him with ordinary words that had to carry their own weight. He found the rail with a scrabble and clung, cheeks bright, glass clasped against his vest like a communion withheld. In that instant Josiah saw the parlor's ivory bell pull in his mind and understood how chords mistake themselves for authority. He saw the library's numbers and how they mistake themselves for law. He saw the dining room's cloth and how it mistakes itself for innocence. The stair had never been guilty of such confusion. Wood knows the bargain it keeps: lift, hold, let go, and ask nothing but the exactness of a foot. He set one knuckle on the rail as if feeling for splinters, and beneath that touch he read the house's diary of passages. Smooth lanes where habit had gone, faint ripples where worry had paused. The auctioneer recovered his balance, the way a man recovers his dignity by pretending it never fell. "Quite all right," he said to no one, to everyone, to the clock perhaps, and he turned his face into a smile that hoped to reshape what had happened into anecdote, and failed. From the bluff the bell offered a single chime, a deliberate punctuation in the paragraph of the night. The sound traveled down the stairwell and touched the back of Josiah's neck like cool cloth. Scripture had yielded to space and time, to the angle of a tread and the weight of a man who believed height a sacrament. The verse would not return to his tongue with its old authority tonight. Josiah moved a step aside, letting the path be path again. The notch remained, no deeper, no prouder, an unassuming memo inked into wood that the world tilts even in houses that deny it. Heat rose from the dining room in a fainter ribbon, the air adjusting to a quieter arithmetic. The clock ticked, not louder, only truer. He descended one turn, then another, toward the place where cloth and flame would soon hold discourse. Behind him the stair kept its vow, to lift what is careful and to instruct what is careless, without malice and without praise. Candle flame trembled in the dining room like a row of narrow spines, each wick whispering to its neighbor. The white cloth stretched from window to hearth, a pale river tamed into straight lines by patient hands. It reflected the brass of candlesticks and the quick silver of spoons, as though virtue could be polished into being. At the head, the matriarch's chair stood in a small climate of authority. Air warmer by a degree, shadow gentler by intent, and the hush that rooms learn to keep for a person who expects it. Grace was said in a voice sanded smooth by decades. Its sugar and salt tasted like comfort and ordinance, not mercy. Around the edges the sideboard gleamed, quiet as a closed ledger. Josiah entered carrying a cut-glass decanter that caught the light and fractured it into modest shards upon the ceiling cornice. He kept to the table's leeward side, where the cloth sheen did not glare back onto his hands. The vents beneath the floor murmured a thin warmth up through the boards. The service door behind him wore its hairline crack like a secret smile, a narrow mouth that admitted a thread of air steady enough to tutor a spark and too small to draw notice. He felt those breaths as a seaman reads current, a slow river moving under the visible water. Along the table's underside, raw wood waited, sapwood grain that still remembered weather, not polish. There, in the dim country beneath ceremony, he had pressed a pinned ribbon of wick and brushed it with a veil of lamp oil until it held the faintest luster, more sensed than seen. It lay in the angle where table belly meets brace, where heat gathers lazily and sound is swallowed. Planted detail, now patient instrument. He moved with the house's rhythm, pour, incline, pass, polish with a sleeve's hem that left nothing a guest would claim. A bell-pull of ivory descended from the ceiling near the mantel, the parlor's pale vein, and he drew it 1 inch only, enough to rouse kitchen attention without stirring a parade. The cord quivered as if considering an errand, and withheld it. Across the room the portrait's painted eyes kept their practiced indifference. The matriarch lifted a hand, and well-trained bodies leaned forward or rested back by habit, while a murmur of platitudes made a music that congratulated itself for being gentle. The first kiss of Ember did not show in fire. It showed in smell. A soft sweetness turned curious, the polite whiff of warmed oil blending into candles' beeswax, neither offensive nor common. Then a change in texture, cloth no longer a single surface, but two, the upper lit world and the undershadow negotiating a new treaty. A corner of napery lifted, breathed, lay back down. The thread he had tended accepted a breath from the service door, and the breath in turn was sharpened by the draft from the vents. Not a leap, a decision. He poured for the elder uncle at the right hand and angled the decanter so the liquid surface trembled against crystal like a small bell under glass. He kept his profile empty of thought. The matriarch's grace ended upon the last syllable with the confidence of punctuation. Forks lifted like ceremony, resuming after an interruption that dared not exist. Silver chimed with a refined sound that mistook itself for innocence. The pinned wick, receiving its lesson, eased forward along the board's lip with a glow no eye watched, teaching cloth to learn a new alphabet. Curl, then hush, then deepen. Draft traveled the room as a courier that knew the back ways. The service door's crack fed a breath up the table's length. The vent gave it weight and warmth. The gap under the sash window sketched the return. Between those three, the ember found companionship. A thin line of smoke offered itself where table's belly warmed, traveling in the small aisle between wood and linen as if learning the table's grace before announcing itself to guests. The scent grew more articulate, paste warmed past obedience, starch reconsidering posture. A guest lifted his head slightly, nose curious, then dismissed it as kitchen business. At the head, the matriarch set down her spoon and reached toward the bell pull, a gesture that presumed the room would remember its place. Josiah saw her hand hover, a pale bird, over an accustomed branch, and then pause when the smallest shadow, no more than a thought, wobbled near her saucer. He stood at the sideboard, polishing a harmless shine into nothing, eyes on the lace of the cloth's hem where it draped. There, a ripple formed, not from hand or foot, but from heat organizing itself into intention. It ran along the table like a whispered rumor, a wave lengthening from the underside outward, the way a bell's tone moves into timbre before it enters the ear. He adjusted a plate a finger's width and felt under his knuckles the faintest enthusiasm in the wood. The Wick's ember, having learned its courtesy, kissed the linen, not a scorch, not yet, just a darkening mote that made a small island in a white sea. The island widened without spectacle, then rested, testing the room's patience. The portrait's eyes kept their composure. Conversation redrew its smile. Only the clock in the hall confessed time's forward motion with its modest, merciless tick. "Pull," the matriarch said at last, soft but sovereign, reaching again. Josiah's hand brushed the bell pull before hers and gave it the same measured inch. A door answered in the distant kitchen, a hinge replied with its new, obedient hush, and a servant beyond moved with the quiet enthusiasm of someone who has been taught to step softer than fate. That inch brought a breath from the service passage, new air, low and neat, up under the board, where the ember accepted it, the way a sentence accepts its verb after a long subject. The cloth brightened at the very edge, blush before fever. A guest reached for salt and hesitated, confused by nothing. The matriarch's chair made its small exhale as she shifted her weight to command. The underworld of the table, wood grain, iron nails, pinned wick, oil, deepened its conversation and arrived at now. Not a flare that would frighten the children or glamour the guilty, an inversion composed to the pitch of consequence. The white, that had once called itself purity, received a mark it had not ordered and would not erase. Josiah set the decanter down so that crystal made a soft, sure note upon the sideboard, the sound a modest amen. He watched smoke choose its path to visible air, then return to the linen's inner country to finish its sentence. Around the table, authority gathered itself like a shawl and found it inadequate. The matriarch lifted her hand to direct and found the room already answering, a thin thread of gray that did not apologize, a warmth that was not comfort. Her gaze sought causes, culprits, accidents. The table offered only effect. Outside, somewhere between bluff and river, iron declared midnight in strokes that seemed to come from the spine of the earth rather than any tower. Each toll walked through the walls without asking leave. With the first, a blossom of heat uncurled under the cloth near the head. With the second, a cousin to that blossom visited the middle. With the third, the far end learned its syllable, the whole sentence now comprehensible even to those who despise reading. Spoons stilled. Breath arranged itself into a hush that could be mistaken for prayer. Josiah did not hurry and did not linger. He let the bell mark the measure and kept to it, gathering the decanter as though nothing had changed and everything had. The cloth gave up its last illusion of command and received its new office, witness. Authority, faced with a sermon it had not written, sat correctly and said nothing. He turned toward the service door, whose crack drew in a little more air with each toll. And in that small draught he felt the house concede a truth it had long refused. The table, accustomed to deciding who sat, who spoke, who ate, now bore what it had never borne, consequence seated at its head. He stepped through the door and let it close to its taut, careful gap, leaving the room to hear what it had been saying all along. The kitchen yard stood between smoke and stars, dew graining the packed earth, until it shone faint as fish scale under the lantern's tired halo. The scullery door's panel was warm to the touch where the house's breath pressed outward. Beyond the threshold, voices shuffled like cards that could no longer pretend order. Josiah crossed to the well with steps that had spent themselves and would not borrow from tomorrow. The cedar bucket waited on its ring, staves dark with use. The rope over the pulley rasped once like an old throat, clearing itself to speak. He dipped the ladle and filled a tin cup, the metal thin enough to sing against the rim. Cold rose from the water, clean and certain, scrubbing smoke from his nostrils in a single breath. He set the brass tinderbox on the well ledge, its square face reflecting a poor man's moon from the lantern glass, and thumbed the hinge, obedient now, quiet as courtesy, so the lid lifted without quarrel. The char and flint inside lay as arranged, not weapons nor trophies, but instruments that had played their measure. He tipped the cup. Water marched over the lip in a narrow sheet and found brass, clinging, then falling. The box hissed modestly, a syllable longer than a sigh. When the last drop slid away, the hinge yielded shut, like a page turned on the final line of an old psalm. He held the tinderbox a moment longer, feeling the cool settle into it until even memory of heat departed. Then he placed it on the low wall where the yard keeps its small altar of used things, buckets, pegs, a broken clay jar that had once known flowers, and let it rest among their honest silence. Nearby, the axe leaned against the tool-room jamb, returned to a posture of rest without stealth, iron dark from night air, half steady against the whitewash like a staff set aside during prayer. He lifted it by the throat, felt the weight that had held rather than harmed, and settled it inside on the rack with the other tools, each handle touching its neighbor with the little tenderness that objects learn when men have not. Names stirred behind his ribs as if asking whether the work had been counted, to them or against them. He answered without a word, feeling each syllable resolve into a place at a table that would never again command him. From the house drifted a thread of warmed starch and candle, remnants of a cloth learning a new grammar, and the faint copper of a bell's far echo mapped itself along the yard's edge like a slim road no surveyor would notice. He sank to a crouch and dipped the cup once more, not to drink, but to pour upon the packed earth beside the scullery step. Water found dust and made a small country of dark, orb-round as a seal, then bled into the soil as if returning a borrowed coin. He traced its edges with a forefinger, the way a clerk might circle a sum that balances at last. The door behind him clicked and rattled in the frame, timbers settling, hinges remembering lesson, then found its poise. He listened to that new composure and let it be a kind of amen. Above the yard, the bluff bell did not speak. It only waited, and waiting is also a language. He turned his face toward the smokehouse path and the slope beyond where the river unspooled its black ribbon toward towns that had never learned his name. The cup hung light in his hand. He set it by the bucket so morning would find it where it belonged, and he stood into the quiet, made clean by cool water and honest dark. The night, having said what it came to say, rested its case. Pre-dawn washed the yard in a color that did not have a name, the kind that makes roosters hesitate. Hoofbeats burst at the gate with the impatience of men who confuse haste for virtue, and voices struck the air sharp as flint on iron. Josiah stood by the carriage shed, hands loose, breath steady, as leather creaked and a lantern threw a wedge of pale honey over axle grease and stacked harness. Cold lifted from the ground in a thin veil. The bluff beyond kept its iron tongue in its mouth, saving speech for a later hour. They set cord to his wrists, rough hemp, not ceremony, and the knot learned its task without swagger. He did not pull. He did not stoop. He let his weight be his weight, and no more. Passing the scullery step, he saw the round stain where water had met dust and made its small country of dark. The circle held like a coin stamped with balance. Doors along the passage found their hinges and behaved not as flatterers do, but as pupils proud of knowing the lesson. Someone swore about ash on the lane. Someone else muttered, "Move him," as if the morning would punish delay. Down the drive, the world widened to a road that remembered wheels. The quarters watched from doorways where the damp had not yet burned off. Faces in shadow, a hand at a child's shoulder, a headscarf pulled tight over sleep. No one called his name. The name moved between ribs instead. A liturgy traded eye to eye. A white scrap flickered at one window. Laundry caught on a peg before the day was rightly lit. And the cloth's small tremor argued against the night's certainty with a stubborn, wind-made gospel. He kept his gaze on the road's seam, that faint crown where water divides to either ditch and refuses to be owned. Town took him at a jolting pace, the trap wheels translating ruts into bone. Smoke climbed from kitchens, and shop shutters learned their hinges for the day's business, rattling like thin coins in a careless pocket. By noon, the courthouse steps accepted his feet, and the columns above made a pale forest where judgment liked to hunt. Inside the hall, the air thickened with bodies and expectations. Pine benches held men who pretended to sit easy, and women who did not pretend at all. A clerk's pen scratched like a mouse behind wainscot. Somewhere a clock's small heart kept time with a confidence that would have seemed brave if it had been human. They set scorched paper on a table as if it were a witness, contracts wrinkled by heat into landscapes no arithmetic could navigate. A man in a good coat spoke of order. Another in a better one spoke of property. A third tried to speak of sorrow and lost his way. No eye had watched flame take a corner. No ear had heard a wick learn its lesson. No hand could swear to a hinge taught to be kind. The room built its case out of smoke and habit. He stood without leaning and let his silence be the nearest true thing in reach. The bell outside chose the hour and did not ask permission. 12 strokes wandered in through the high sash-like weather, settling dust that had nothing to do with law. The judge labored to keep cadence, but iron does not share a stage. On the 3rd stroke a child coughed and was hushed. On the 8th, a woman pressed linen to her mouth, the square of white disguising her face and revealing it more completely. On the 12th, the clerk's pen paused as if it, too, had heard its name. Josiah watched the sound seat itself in the room as if the hour had come to listen, rather than to speak. He answered when asked what could be answered without lying. He refused the trap of a confession shaped to please the paper's hunger. His hands, bound, rested like tools laid gently at day's end. Someone muttered insolence, someone else grief. The words braided in the air and forgot which strand they belonged to. In that confusion, faces revealed what speeches hide, the envy that righteousness wears, the fear that wealth perfumes, the admiration that dares not clothe itself in applause. When they led him back through the portico, the noon glare found every edge and made it honest. The white cloths in the gallery, which had veiled gasps, now hung limp as surrendered sails, and yet the people beneath them stood like ships that had not agreed to turn. Outside, heat lifted the scent of tar from the road, and the bell, finished for the moment, left its shape on the day the way water leaves a bed in sand. He descended the steps and felt stone report his weight to itself, not as accusation, not as mercy, only as fact. The cord at his wrists rasped when he moved. He measured his breath with the small clock of his own chest, and the rhythm refused to change for spectacle. A boy on the curb looked up and said nothing. The boy's eyes put his own name in a ledger no clerk would ever see. Josiah met that gaze and let it hold for the space between ticks. Then the guard tugged, the road opened, and he went forward into the bright where consequence keeps house, the hall behind him full of papers that would outlast no one, and a bell whose echo could not be sentenced. Afternoon thinned toward a milk-colored light that slipped through the barred window and laid a pale stripe on the holding-room wall. The bench beneath Josiah gave no comfort and asked for none. Wood remembered other backs and kept its counsel. Dust loitered where the sun could not quite reach, and the air tasted of lime-wash and iron, clean in the way that denies breath its share of sweetness. Beyond the glass, road dust hung in a small republic of motes that rose and fell when wagons passed, an hourglass that never agreed to finish. He sat with his hands open on his knees, wrists reddened by cord that had long since learned its lesson and been removed. The quiet made a sound when listened to properly. A far hinge in the hall clearing its throat, a key turning a careful degree, and no more, a shoe sole speaking once to the plank and stepping away. Time did not stride here, it pooled. He let his back find the wall and felt the cool leach the heat from him in a slow exchange that seemed fair. Memory arranged itself without his bidding. The auction steps, the boy, the strip of white knotted to a sleeve. Once a flag of price, a small wind-broken claim. That cloth in the mine's room unknotted and rose to a rope stretched between cabin posts, where laundry learned the grammar of sky. Shirts bellied and settled, petticoats made pale clouds with hems for horizons. A scrap became a pennant that did not hail a buyer, but welcomed a breeze. The same color that had once narrowed a life now widened it, asking nothing but air. He turned his head to the window. Bars divided the world into 5 narrow fields of view, and in each a piece of road existed and was sufficient. A cartwheel showed, then was gone. A hat brim crossed the lowest pane. The shadow of a bird laid a brief signature and lifted off, as if the roof itself had found wings. He watched light move along the iron as if reading a sentence in a language where every letter had been pared to bone. The bell that had told him judgment was coming now waited between strokes, and the waiting, he found, was gentler than the telling. A lock spoke in the corridor with a modest click. He did not flinch. Doors had been tyrants and teachers both. They had served him and summoned him, betrayed and redeemed. But they were only wood, only iron. In his inward eye they opened upon air that belonged to no one, and the hinges, oiled, instructed, swung because purpose had met kindness for once. Names moved behind his ribs, not clamoring for witness now, simply sitting together like kin on a porch in late light, letting the day's weather belong to itself. The axe in memory no longer threatened or wedged. It leaned, a staff at rest. The ledger did not tally. It forgot. He breathed, counted that breath with the small clock of the body, and thought of a hearth. Not the library fire that taught paper humility, not the dining room warmth that turned cloth from boast to witness, but a simple fire in a low room, flames no taller than a hand, where hands held out could be warmed without contract or command. In that imagining, the tinderbox did not plot. It napped cool on a shelf, a tool among tools, honest as a spoon. White cloth hung a little apart to dry, and when it stirred, it did not announce ownership. It consented to wind, and consenting, made a modest music. Footsteps paused beyond the door, moved on. The bench creaked once as he shifted and let his shoulders come forward, making his own shelter where none had been provided. Light thinned further until the stripe on the wall became the color of skimmed milk, and then the color of nothing at all. He closed his eyes to keep the last of it, and when he opened them the iron had cooled to a darker thought. The bell did not speak. It kept company. Evening would come, and with it whatever habit calls consequence to its table. He sat where he was and allowed the cloth in his mind to lift and lift until, untethered from any hand, it became a sky. Doors and locks and hinges, taught by use and by refusal, turned not toward prisons, but thresholds. The world, even paired to a cell and a slit of road, held enough room to rehearse a different meaning for what had been used against him. He let that meaning take its seat and did not rush it, for mercy, like light in such a room, arrives by slow degrees and stays only if treated with care. Years turned like river bends, slow and absolute, And the story walked ahead of footprints, taking the levee path at dusk and the porch steps at first light. In the quarters that later learned to call themselves by their own names, elders sat with tin cups cooling in their palms and let the tale unspool without hurry. It did not require a ledger to keep its shape. It lived in the way a bell's tone lingers after silence has claimed the air. Children leaned forward, knees dusty, faces tipped toward the voice, as if toward a lamp set low, so eyes need not ache to see. They spoke of Josiah Greene, not as a miracle, but as a measure, a way to gauge the worth of doors and the honesty of cloth, and the lies that paper tells when it thinks no one is listening. Under cottonwood shade, someone would lift a scrap of white to wave a child back from a ditch, and the gesture, practical as it was, remembered another meaning, that whiteness can serve the living when it is no longer a tag for sale. On wash days, shirts flared along the lines like small sails that had found a better river. On Sundays, collars gleamed not to flatter, but to honor a backbone straightened by vows. The axe leaned in the corner of a shed, a tool again. Its silence weighed more than its bite ever did. Voices learned to count hours by more than tower bells. They listened to Hinge talk and could say whether a house was generous or mean. They heard the difference between a latch that invites and a lock that threatens, between a table that seats power and a board that nourishes strength. Where ledgers once ruled, a little girl kept a slate and made her sums, and when she wrote her father's name, she traced it twice, not for mistakes, but to ensure the chalk took. Names, once written by others into columns like fence rails, now crossed borders as kin crossed roads at their choosing. Each repetition of a name in the mouth of a child bent the world away from forgetting. The story refused to harden into a single order of events. In one telling, the ember learned its path the way a prayer learns a throat. In another, a door remembered mercy before a man did. In a third, the bell itself was said to have chosen the hour like an old friend who knows when to knock. Discrepancies did not trouble the circle. They proved that truth can wear more than one coat and still be decent. What mattered was cadence, how silence preceded the deed, how consequence followed and then sat down to catch its breath, how memory did the walking afterward and would not accept a ride from forgetfulness. By the river, a woman washing sweet potatoes in a washtub lifted her wrists and let water sheet off, then said to the child beside her, "Hear that?" The boy paused. "Not the ferry," she said. "The other one?" And the bluff bell answered once, its iron softened by distance into something like a brother's hand on the shoulder. Across the fields, the wind shook door leaves on new-built cabins. None of those doors feared a key they did not own. In that rustle, people recognized the sound of passage, not escape only, but return, not closing, but threshold. When winter came thin and early, quilts pieced from white and color alike hung over chairs to tame the draft. A square of fabric the old ones would not have touched, too near the memory of a knot on a boy's sleeve, now took its place among blues and browns and reds, become sky in the pattern, or river, or dawn. The past, stitched into use, warmed actual bones. A young man passing the courthouse at noon lifted his cap without bowing, and the bell acknowledged with a single stroke that behaved itself. The tale never needed parchment. It needed a mouth willing to carry both sorrow and laughter without wasting either. It needed a room, even if only the size of a stoop, where a door could be set ajar while talk went on. And it needed children who would learn the grammar, that an axe can be a shoulder, that a ledger can turn to ash without smoke choking the future, that white can lift without claiming, that bells sometimes measure courage rather than hours, that names can be said like blessings until they answer back. So memory kept traveling, not as a parade, not as a secret, but as a road that appears underfoot once a first step is taken. In late light, when the day turned its face toward rest, someone would close the telling with a palm warmed against a cup, and the quiet satisfied, and the circle would rise slower than they sat, reluctant to break what they had made together. If this account finds a home in the heart, return and keep the watch by subscribing, leave a sign of favor, and set a thought or question among the remarks, so the ring of witnesses may widen and the next name come forward. If this remembrance has found good lodging with you, return and keep the watch by subscribing. Lend a sign of favor with a like, and set your question or thought among the remarks, that the circle of witness may grow.